Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the third webinar of Effective Workplace Communications, a short course presented by IT Masters on behalf of Charles Sturt University. My name is Guy Coward, IT Masters short course MC, and your mentor, of course, is Brenton Birchmore. Not much from me tonight, thank goodness, just the usual reminders, and I've already launched the poll so you can have a look at that one. How well does your workplace team communicate based on the standards we have discussed during this course so far? Yeah, just the usual reminder, we use Zoom for our webinars in order to encourage questions and chat. We'll have a Q&A session at the end, and if there's any really relevant questions, I'll interrupt Brenton's lecture. Hannah, of course, is here in the IT Masters administrative role, looking after the course page at learn.itmasters.edu.au. So thank you. And of course, Brenton is here. I might introduce you nice and quickly, Brenton. The answers for the poll, most are sort of saying they're doing quite well, but communicating well enough most of the time. Only 7% saying they're doing really well. 30% saying they're just average, and a full 15% are saying they're poor. 4% dysfunctional. Quite interesting.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Guy, for easing us into all that and for rolling that poll out. And hello, everyone else. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome. We are back for week 3, and we're going to talk about some of the teamwork dynamics, how it all hangs together interactively. And I want to launch and start with this poll, which you can all see, and it's meant mainly for all of you to look and say, okay, how does everyone else feel? Because we all live in our little bubbles, we live in our world, and quite often it's hard to know how average or how normal that might really be. So here we can see that most people say that it's pretty good, but there's a lot of people that feel that, well, there's at least something to improve. And so there's really only 6% of this poll that say that most of it works pretty well consistently. So if we're feeling like, well, there's a few things that I'd like to do better, there's a few things that I'd like my peers to do better, you're not alone. There's a lot of people that feel in a somewhat similar way. All right. Now, before we kick into some of the content we want to talk about tonight, I wanted to tell you about Perdoco. This is an app that I've built recently. It's still in beta mode, so we're still trialing things and still needing your feedback. We're going to launch next week a short scenario. Perdoco is a scenario engine. What it does is it offers an interactive scenario that you might participate in over a few days. It's going to throw problems at you. So it's an app that's you're going to have a team, a fake team. They're not real people, but they're going to throw challenges at you. And the challenges will all be related to the things we've covered, the effective workplace communications. So you get to make decisions and you get to manage priorities and see how your scores travel and how you respond to these various decisions. Not very time consuming, might be a few minutes a day. We'll send an announcement out next week when that scenario is ready to go. If you want to get ahead of that, you can grab the app, you can download, sign up, sign in and do all of that. But the scenario isn't there yet. There is another scenario there, which is IT service management, but this scenario will be up in a few days. We'll let you know. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week for those of you who might have participated during then. But anyway, that's just a heads up. Hang fire on that. It'll be along your way shortly. But when we're talking about tonight, we're going to talk about communications in group situations. We're going to talk about the dynamics. And we can't really cover that or talk about that unless we talk about culture, communications culture. And what does it mean for our ability to get things done, to communicate in a team? Because communicating in the workplace is implicitly about how we interact with other people. And we as humans create these artificial groups, we create teams, and we're going to talk more about how that works from a communications point of view. But I want to talk a bit about where communications culture comes from and what it is and what it isn't. And hopefully if we can drill down on it a little more deeply, we can have a few answers as to how we can improve it. So the first step, and I don't want this to sound negative, but habits come from the human desire to minimize our effort, to be efficient with what we do. So we sometimes have habits in the way we communicate, mainly because making the effort to think and make decisions about how we should communicate moment by moment, message by message, that's demanding, that's time consuming. Our mind doesn't want to do that. So we devolve down to certain habits that we narrow down our decision making. And that's normal, inescapable, that's being human. But we need to understand and acknowledge where they come from. It comes from something that's familiar, easy to do. The group culture, when habits become collective by a number of people, when several people follow it and do it in the same way, they create expectations for those that participate around them. So this is where you get collective habit. So a group culture can be defined as little more than an evolved collective habit where people behave in a certain way and influence others to behave in either similar or reciprocal ways. So it's merely an extension of the habits idea that we started with. But we also, in communications, have habits that are a relationship dynamic, the way in which we communicate with another person. If you think about some of the people you communicate regularly, where you have it a little bit different, the way you communicate is a bit different from other people. That's based on a relationship kind of habit. It's still a habit. And it's still something that either us or they will need to proactively and deliberately work on to change the dynamics. And the habits inform how we broadcast, how we reach out with our communications, but the habits also impact how we reply, how we respond, how we receive. It impacts the assumptions we make. It impacts the context we begin with, the disposition that we either project or reply with. It influences everything, every decision that we might otherwise consciously make because we don't want to consciously make them. So we have our own personal habits, we have the group cultural habits, we have the one-to-one relationship habits, but then you can get these things that apply across an entire organization or department or team. And this is where they become systemic. This is where you can get a situation where the kind of acceptance of certain cultural communications habits amongst a group of people in an organization that is not acted upon by certain authoritative elements within the organization. It's considered to therefore be condoned, accepted. It's something that the organization says, well, by virtue of the fact that we haven't worked to evolve this, we are therefore complicit in saying, well, we're allowing it to happen, even when it's not healthy, even when it's not good. So this is, in general terms, at every layer, this is simply the lack of applied effort, the lack of application of decision-making. This is a lack of conscious decision-making. When it happens at the organizational level, then the whole organization and its outcomes will suffer. So, when we talk about the relationship between culture and, let's talk about policy, if we want to try and change the macro issues, the big picture items about how an organization and its team members or its participants might communicate, we often think about, well, let's have a policy, let's have some rules, let's have a framework, let's do something that says, well, we've got some expectations here that are separate from the way people are used to interacting. Now, we have to remember that all of the habits, whether they're unique, whether they're one-to-one, or whether they're grouped, they're usually, we humans develop habits for our benefit. We don't normally have a habit that's great for someone else at our expense. It's normally a self-reinforced habit. So anytime we look at altering a habit, we have to know that we are working against self-interest. That's going to be the obstacle we have to push past. The fact that whatever habits exist are there because it's easier for the practitioners. And what we have in culture is merely the evolution of what's been accepted over time. And that gets evolved because of certain pressures. So you'll find that communications habits will change, but they'll change in response to certain things. So if you stop and think for a moment about what's changed for you, for your organization, for your team, since the work from home phenomenon has really kicked us hard in the last few months. So if you think, you will probably identify certain things that have changed for you and for those around you, some for good, some for better, but they will have changed because of the pressures upon them, and the people have changed. So when you have an evolved, naturally evolving culture impacting the communications habits, you get an uneven influence by certain stakeholders. You get some stakeholders that are more vocal. You get some stakeholders that are more influential, whether it's through their personality, whether it's through their reach, whether it's through their authority. Different people will influence and evolve those communications differently. And their people's disposition, their willingness to stick to a disposition, the way in which they handle politics and diplomacy will all influence or change the amount of influence they have, which means it's organic and it's responding to things that nobody necessarily has a great deal of control over. So what you get at the end of it is not necessarily what's best, what's effective, not best for the outcomes, which are the organizational outcomes that sit above all of these humans. So the idea of a policy is an opportunity to change the way the evolutionary process works, but it's still an evolutionary process. There is not much revolution that we can bring to changing team-based communications habits. It has to generally happen incrementally. Yes, occasionally we can have a dramatic incident and we can bring a bigger hammer and we can hit something hard because it really does need to be hit that hard. Something that most people would agree was a really bad phenomenon and we've got to stomp that out. And those, in some cases, you might get a mandate for change that's bigger than you might get incrementally. But most change will be slow and incremental. But a policy-based process is a way of saying, well, let's find out what the real issues are. Let's find out what the real obstacles are, the real weaknesses. What is going wrong with our team culture of communications, and how is that affecting the goals that we're all aiming for, and how can we improve that? So a policy as a evolutionary process can be informed by things like, what are the goals of the organization? What's the objectives of the team? Can be informed by what data are we working with? What information do we have? What do we know? What's caused what? What's resulted in what? What are our experiences? These things can more objectively filter down into the conversations. You can have the conversations that would otherwise get drowned out with a natural cultural-based evolution of communications. So what you get at the end of the day, though, is not going to be driven entirely by policy. No matter how much policy you throw at it, it's going to be a compromise of part policy and part of the way that humans embrace or don't, or respond to, or react to the policy. But the policy is just one more pressure. Okay, so go back up to this point here, right? There's still a culture. It's always going to be there. It might have just been influenced by this mechanism, by policy. And we hope it would, and we hope there should always be some kind of policy that says the entity that sits above all of us, which is the organizational entity, it's a stakeholder too. And the way it exerts its pressure is via policy as a method, as a tool. But it's still gonna, what actually happens is still gonna be a blend. So it was Peter Drucker that was quoted as saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, or words to that effect. I may have gotten that slightly wrong, but informed and inclusive policy is your best chance of trying to incrementally improve the way in which a group of people communicate.
Super interesting, Brendan. I'm wondering about, I guess the thing that I was thinking almost the whole time you were talking about was society broadly and the Black Lives Matter protests that are happening, how that would apply to this sort of, to the previous slide. It seems that there's a bunch of stakeholders that feel like they're, they don't have enough power, and they've sort of turned to this almost revolutionary discourse. And would that be a failure of policy? Would it be a combination of both culture and policy?
I would say failure is a big word in this context, but what I would say is that there is a gap between the way in which policy has had an impact and the rate at which it's had an impact, and the rate at which change is expected by what is apparently large sections of the community, because they've shown that they are expecting a different rate of change, a different degree of change than what policy has been able to deliver. And what this, a lot of this discourse, this sudden discourse now is all about is this bringing out the awareness that, hang on, policy-based change has been too slow for a significant sector of the population. And they've reached a threshold, a conflict threshold that says that we're now willing to invest in conflict because we're no longer willing to invest in tolerance. And so this is why you get people that take different courses of action, because the change is not happening at the rate that they need it to. So the question of who's failing whom is much more complicated. Certainly there are plenty of indications that there's examples of real failure and tragic failure where that's occurred. But the question is, how do you get back to systemic change that will make those sorts of failures a lot less likely, and try to take them away from the system? So I agree with you. I think you're spot on. It's a very dramatic example of that. And it is partly about communications, because this is about a conversation that has been going on for a long time that isn't yielding results to the extent that sections of the community really needed to see. And a growing section of the community too.
Thanks.
I just noticed the slide. Do I need to just pause this to put the slides up? Is that something we should do now for people, or should we do that at the end?
Oh no, we'll keep going. We'll get the slides at the end, folks.
Okay, so if you're missing the slides, they'll be up there by the end of this tonight. So let's go back and talk a bit about teamwork, because I want to talk about what it is and where it comes from. If we're going to talk about communications as a group, we need to talk about why. And I want to go back to what motivates, or why do humans work together? And there's an idea that we are a social species. It's true, we are. And a lot of our behavior gets pinned on the fact that, we are a social species, therefore we do these certain things. But there's also a reversal of that. So to say that we work as a team because we're a social species, it's not necessarily the case. It's actually more the other way around. So if you take the perspective of, why did we ever work together? Well, if you go back tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, when early humans were trying to survive on the savannah, most things that we preyed upon and that preyed upon us were stronger, tougher, better than us physically. And the reason we survived was because we were able to work together. There's other factors, of course, but a big part of our survival is because of our teamwork. So did we get together as a team because we were already a social species? Or did we become a social species because in order to survive, we had to work together? If you take the latter, then survival is a fundamental and primal element to why humans work together, which means it's quite natural for humans, under the right circumstances, to lean towards teamwork. It's not unnatural, it's not out of the ordinary. Where it struggles is where you have the conflict with the other survival instinct, and that's personal survival. So self-interest. And that's where you get the element that people will work together in a team, and they will work better in a team that they are more familiar with. The more familiarity, the better they will work together. And this starts to speak to the underlying principles of where all forms of discrimination come from. Anything that's not like us means that we are naturally less comfortable with it. And once we get to know that, then we become more comfortable. And in a corporate environment, in a commercial environment, in a professional environment, we always have some degree of interplay between individuals. We might be a team, but there's still elements that make us need to look out for ourselves. When they are stronger than our desire for teamwork, then the teamwork will suffer. But it's not the structure itself that defines whether or not there is a team or there's teamwork. It's the interactions. Now, we bring, as humans, especially in professional corporate space, we bring artificial things into this and say, well, we've got a team, we're going to give it a name, we're going to put a hierarchy in place. But it's the interaction that is the true definition of whether or not a group of people are a team. And that interaction, of course, is communications. So whether or not a team is really a team and how much of a team is it really is going to depend upon the communications. And if that's flawed, if that's dysfunctional, if that's suffering because of various reasons, some of which we've talked about, then you're not going to have teamwork. You're not going to have a team dynamic. You don't need to have the artificial structure to create teamwork. There's been studies done of doctors that work, telework and work remotely, and they have to go to different hospitals at different times and work with a new bunch of other doctors and nurses and professionals. And when they're familiar with each other, they work far more effectively with better health outcomes. But they're not a structure. They might only be together for one operation. And they're a structure only for that operation. But the teamwork they do, because of the way they communicate, is still more effective. So can we put these artificial things around it, put all these phenomena together and say, well, now we've got a team, we can expect good results? You might have all of these structures, but the single biggest, most important element that will define the success of the team will be its communications. Let's look at a couple of definitions. This is going to be familiar to all of you. I'll skim through this fairly quickly. I want to separate some of these because I want to talk about the last one in a little more detail. With task work is a word to simply describe the effort that people do. Whether or not there's connectivity between the different people and their effort is not important. Task work is simply the activity. When you get to coordinated task work, it's where you get synergy out of the effort. So you get coordination. Let's use a simplistic example, a tandem bicycle, two people riding a bicycle, one sitting behind the other. So there needs to be a degree of coordination between these two people. They both got to pedal at the same time. They have to lean the same way. But that's the extent. They don't need to do much more than those things. And they're quite simplistic and mechanical and procedural. And that's all it takes, a bit of synergy. And we've got coordination. When we need to cooperate is when we rely upon the uniqueness of the different contributions. So imagine that this bicycle, these tandem riders, were delivering food. So now you've got the person at the front is the one that can see where they're going. They're steering. They need the navigation. They need the GPS tools. They need the address of where they're going and how to get there. The person on the back is the person that's holding the food and holding the umbrella that keeps the both riders dry. So they've got an important job to do, but they're different jobs. But they're only going to get there with a dry parcel if they both cooperate. But they're not necessarily collaborating yet. When they need to create and make decisions, that's when the interdependence takes on a new meaning. So let's say these two people, they're not just making one delivery. They have to get through an entire shift of deliveries. So they have to decide, are they taking turns? Who's at the front? Who's at the back? Who takes care of the bike? Who takes the food to the front door? They might have to decide what route, which place first. They might have to make decisions about the direction to go, when to take a break. Now they're making decisions. That's collaboration. If you have a purely technical task where you can specify all of the activities in advance, then maybe coordination, cooperation is enough. But when you need collaboration, the level of communication that's required goes up exponentially. And the impact on the outcomes from those communications also goes up in proportion. So a team that needs to collaborate, where they need to make collective decisions that rely upon each other's strengths, any weaknesses in their communication will have a significantly higher impact on what they're able to accomplish, because the structure is not going to be enough for them to get past it. So we'll talk a bit about collaboration at the end of this slide, then let's pause and see if we've got any good questions about these points that we've been through. So we're talking about, to be collaborative, there needs to be a shared understanding and a shared ownership of whatever the goal is that sits above everybody. Because we all have to contribute constructively to the decisions necessary to reach it. And the only way we can do that if we have communicated adequately about what the vision is, why we're all on it, do we all have a unified understanding of that vision, and how we each can contribute to it, and how we are responsible for each piece of that. Do we have the freedom to make those decisions? Do we have the freedom to recognize where someone else has a contribution that we don't have and can't make, and promote that, make space for that, make room for that? Do we have the freedom to make mistakes? Do we have the freedom to be honest and to be trusted and to gain trust amongst those co-decision makers? So if we're creating something new, something that hasn't existed before, or something more than that, then we need to be able to have amongst the team members an adequate respect for each individual's contribution, for their reason to be there, for what they're there for. And that needs to be a starting pillar for how they communicate. If you think back to some of those teams where it seems a little bit, there's someone out in the cold, there's someone who's not in it, maybe they're not joining in, or maybe they're not easily welcomed, but there's some kind of demarcation between different parts of the team. That usually comes down to this particular point. Not enough respect. And maybe it's because the team composition is poor, or maybe it's because there hasn't been enough communication about who's doing what and why. But in order to have that communication, in order to generate that right level of respect, we need to be willing to check our assumptions, to challenge assumptions, to cross over boundaries. So we need to be able to have a greater level of understanding of the other people in our team. We need to more deeply understand who they are, what they're doing, what they can contribute, and have respect for that as a starting point for us to be able to communicate in a way that's going to be productive, and not communicate in a way that's going to make them trigger their self-preservation. So we go back to the teamwork psychology that we talked about. People will naturally gravitate to want to identify, be part of a team. They will generally want to be part of that and do that. And the only reason they won't, usually, is personal threat, where they feel it costs them too much personally. So that's the primary goal at the beginning of team formation. If we can deal with that, we will have a much better environment, an opportunity for the team to synergistically communicate, and great things can come out of it. Let's pause and see if we've got any good questions.
Yeah, beauty. There's three fairly similar questions, and I'll throw them all at you at once and see if we can roll them into one answer.
Yep.
Fabrizio asks, I'm wondering how the culture of communication can be improved from a team member perspective. Right. A former student of yours, I believe, Ibrahim Bangura, has asked, how do you create a culture that encourages communication in both directions in an organization? And Ram has asked, how do we survive in a team if someone hates in the team, or the manager hates in the team?
They're similar. They're all big in their own way. So leadership, big word, often a catch-all for many solutions, but leadership as opposed to management. And the leadership element means that anybody, no matter what their apparent authority in an organization, we can all lead by example. We all have the capacity to behave in a way and therefore gain some sort of opportunity to influence others' behavior. This goes back to the reciprocation issue that we talked about in week 1. Now, first of all, I'm going to acknowledge that if we're not in an immediately influential position, then creating change from those positions is very difficult. So I'm not suggesting that this is an easy fix. But the starting point is to decide what our own habits, what our own standards are, and then demonstrate them consistently, and then use that as a platform to expect some level of reciprocation, and use that as a mechanism to demonstrate success outcomes. So go back to the one-to-one habits, create one-to-one habit improvements with other people. So you start with the easy ones, right? Yeah, like there's lots of angry going on elsewhere, but you and I got this sorted out, right? We understand each other. Okay, that's one, right? And then the next one and the next one, and then Then you start working on the ones that are really difficult, and you just say, look, can you and I just have an understanding? Because this would really help me succeed. And what they won't do for others, they might do for you if you are demonstrating that you're going to give something to them. You're going to give them a standard. You're going to give them respect. And this is an incremental whittling down of these problems little bit by little bit. Because if that person that hates or that person that's a problem can find a way to deal slightly better with you, then maybe they'll figure out that actually doing that's a little bit better with others, and maybe some sort of change will happen. Or maybe you'll create some conversation that lets people higher up with more authority on policy to start entering that conversation and say, yeah, we can see a difference here. We need to do something about it.
Thank you.
What else we got?
Anne's asked a question about hierarchy and whether that actually creates divisions in mindset. She says teams are more relevant now than ever. Sometimes hierarchy creates divisions in mindset. Your comments?
I think it does. So I mentioned before about structure and the way humans bring structure in. And structure is brought in primarily to orchestrate the distribution of power. So a hierarchy is a structure that's brought in to manage the up and down movement of power, the delegation and the escalation of decision-making to different levels of power structure. And that's what a hierarchy is meant to do. And hierarchies do not in and of themselves encourage teamwork. So when you have a structure that says, now we're going to laterally distribute power and we're going to laterally distribute it to encourage decision-making from crossing over different boundaries. And then you can have a team that might include people that are in the hierarchy or at different levels, but within a team structure, it's more flat and more linear. Then their contribution will be based on whatever they're putting in. And so the way in which they communicate has an opportunity, at least, to operate at a different level, to bypass that authority boundary. If you just use an authority of hierarchical structure, absolutely, you're going to limit your opportunity for teamwork. You're only going to get teamwork because you're only going to get that like-minded, people like me, other people on my level. They're the ones that are like me. And so I'm going to look out, that's my team. And if that's not what your team needs to be, then that's what you've got to change. So diminish the importance of the hierarchy in situations. And at least in those situations, you might have a chance of getting past it.
Interesting. Altair, maybe the last one for now. We'll keep moving after that. Lots of good questions coming in, folks. Altair has asked, what would be the effect of social communications on the team professional communications? So I'm sort of thinking team building sort of stuff as well.
So I'm going to make an assumption about what's meant there in social communications. So if we talk about social communications as being the sharing of communications outside of the kind of sharing that needs to happen for the professional outcomes. So it's the chat that goes on outside of it. And that's where you get into the gossip, the politics, and all of the other personal interactions and relationship elements that is kind of parallel to, but not entirely connected to the professional relationships. And you find that they tend to be a barometer of what's going on in terms of team dynamics. So when people feel that others are like them and there's a team feeling that, yeah, this is my team, I'm part of this, I relate to this, we are a good team, then the social interactions will generally be more positive. So that's a consequence. And because it's a consequence, it's also a good indicator. So when you get poisonous, toxic kind of social interactions between certain people, that definitely suggests that there's a fundamental problem with the communications, the interaction, probably linking back to how they relate to those people and the lack of a team dynamic, the lack of a team perspective. So the effect of it is, it's not that it's going to come and cause the problem. It's usually that it's the indicator that there is a problem, although it can make those problems worse. So vectors of change, we talked about the vectors, how we apply this to collaboration. Know the vision, know what the purpose is, know what the goal is, respect the contributors. And then when people do things, we value the effort and the outcomes and their role within that. So there's a sense of ownership and empowerment over what's actually happened. because it's a result that we've respected it along the way, and now we value and empower future effort because there's value assigned to it and demonstrated value. Now, we talk about collaboration. I'm going to talk briefly. In fact, I'm going to go through this fairly lightly because there is one of the pre-recorded audio files that goes through this in some detail. But I'm going to give the quick version of this. We're going to talk about collaboration tools, and I'm talking about software, systems, applications, all the things that we often have to use on a regular basis. How we use the tool is far more important than what that tool is or what its features are or what it can do. So one of the mistakes that a lot of organizations make when they're trying to go through the process of, well, what kind of collaboration tool should we use? The more important question is, how should we use it? Because that's what connects to the communications dynamics, which is the fundamental principle of how a team works and how healthy it is. So the tool, it doesn't define the team. The tool doesn't define how they work. The tool is merely the potential of how it could work if it's used in a certain way. So if people strictly follow using tools in a certain way, then those tools can be used to their advantage. But if they don't strictly follow, if we go back to the lazy habit, this is the easy way for me, then your collaboration, and I'm talking about collaboration because it's the pinnacle of what teams need to achieve. If you don't have enough discipline in the use of collaboration tools, you're not empowering the other people. And in a collaborative environment, everyone needs to empower everybody else. You have to have the respect to say, I'm gonna enter this data and keep it up to date. That's my contribution, because someone else is making a decision that relies on that data being up to date. And the reason I'm doing it is not because it's in my KPI that says thou shalt enter this stuff. It's because the team will succeed because they need that data and I need them to put their data in so I can use it too. So we need to be able to look at tool use in the three same ways as the vectors of change. So there's a certain amount of information that's just purely the knowledge, the data, the info that's in there. But then there's how we engage with it, the habits that we all have. It's our reactions. How do we feel about it? And we all have an element of love, hate with the tools that we use. Some of the tools we know help our day, and others we know that, well, even when they do, sometimes they have annoyances as well. So there's an engagement dynamic, and that's unique to each of us. But it's the discipline, that's the action part of it, that determines ultimately whether or not that tool is being used effectively, and therefore whether or not that team is reaching its potential. So we all know the proverb, a good worker never blames his tools. Let's look at 8 attributes of tools. Now, this isn't meant to be a thing that says, well, before you go and buy a tool, make sure it's got all of these. They all have all of these. The question is, for your team, for the way you work, and if you're looking at a team that struggles to work effectively, maybe you go back to some of these quick points and see if your use of any collaboration tools, whether it's a communications tool, whether it's a document, whether it's an app, whether it's anything, are you missing some of these things, right? So you can't work collaboratively without information that's adequately up to date. You can't work as a collaborative team unless you all have an aligned understanding of what the tool's meant to do, when it's meant to be used, how it's meant to work, what's meant to be in it, what's not. You can't have a collaborative team unless the person who needs the information has it when they need it. Not currency is that information up to date, but timeliness is, well, is it there when I need it? Can I find it when I need it? Can people find what's relevant to them? Are people making decisions in the dark? Because the information might be there on time and it might be up to date, but they can't reach it, or they can't find what's relevant. They can't articulate the question, or the question being articulated doesn't result in the right information for them. You've got not knowing who made this decision, who put this data in there, where did this come from? So it's what this thing is and who originated it, who's connected to it, who's involved, who should I check with, who should I inform? It's those connecting between those 2 points, making sure that it's valid. Can we trust it? Has it been proven? Has the accuracy had a test applied to it? Sometimes that really matters. Sometimes it doesn't, but sometimes it really does. Can it be used? Is it in a format that makes it useful? Is it in a format that makes it painful? Does that pain make people reluctant to use it? Is adoption low because usability is poor? And lastly, governance, this is really about knowing what the other 7 results are like. Do we even know? Do we know whether or not our data and our tools and what we're using it for is working with validated data? Do we know whether our tool is delivering attribution? Do we know whether it's got timely data in it where people can find what they want? The governance is the bit that says, we have ways of checking. We have some tests, we have some reports, we have something that tells us whether or not our tools, our collaboration tools, are doing their job. And this can be equally applied to whatever communications system you're using, whether it's the things we talked about last week. It could be email, it could be the various tools that are now blending management of information, documents, etc., with communications. So I won't go more into detail about this because there's lots more about it in the pre-recorded audio. So let's talk for a moment about facilitating. So when we're talking about facilitating, we're talking about as a person in a team environment, you need to facilitate an outcome. And that outcome could be anything. Could be a decision, could be an understanding. Where does a facilitator get their power from? There's a few different areas where a person can be empowered as a facilitator, as a person that others will look to and will allow to influence them towards an outcome. And that could be competency. So a person might say, well, I'm gonna let Fred lead this because Fred knows his stuff. Fred knows this stuff. And that competency is something that others might respect. And Fred's good at running this. Or it could be that we're saying, no, well, I'm going to turn up for this and I'm going to participate. I'm going to pay attention because Mary's the boss. And so there's some sort of hierarchical, structural, external force element that says, this facilitator is someone that I'm going to pay attention to. Or it could be because they're really good at getting outcomes. They're good at getting results. They may not have raw authority. They may not have deep, specific knowledge, but they know how to work with people who do have the knowledge, and they know how to share authority and get things done. So these are the people who are good at creating outcomes regardless. And they get their results because they have buy-in from the other participants. That's where someone says, well, yeah, I'm going to participate in this meeting because so-and-so is someone who gets results. He's fair, he's even, she does it the right way. I'm in. So competency, very intellectual-based decision. Politics, external force, is fear-based. It's emotional. But leadership is motivational. People will give you energy. People will give you their effort. They will give you their discretionary power if they subscribe to your facilitation. You don't have to have anything other than an ability to manage the outcomes. The interesting thing about facilitating most of the time is not about centralizing power. That's presenting. That's coordinating. When you're facilitating, you're distributing the power, and that's your job. You're responsible for ensuring that others, as needed, are empowered. And that means that whether or not you're the leader, the boss, the manager of a team, if you are a facilitator of anything that happens in that team, you are one that others will look to encourage mutual respect, to encourage a certain standard of communications, to encourage a certain way for people to interact. You will be the voice of policy simply because you are representing the outcome that you are facilitating towards. So let's think about meetings, right? We love meetings. We all enjoy, we've all had hours spent. Okay, if you add it all up, many of us have probably spent months in meetings in our lifetime. So let's look at meetings in a very simple manner. Meetings have 3 stages. Any kind of facilitated engagement, meeting, workshop, anything, 3 stages. Engagement, right? Getting people, this is before it happens. So engagement is being ready. It's sharing what information needs to be shared beforehand. I mean, how many times have we been to a meeting and you don't know what's going on, why you're there, why is he there, why is she there? What do I need to know beforehand? I've got to figure that out as the meeting unfolds. This shouldn't happen. Information needs to be distributed before the meeting that says people are ready to contribute. Next stage is momentum. This is what happens in the meeting. And this is usually the only thing that happens in the meeting. As a facilitator, you're responsible for the objective. That's all you're responsible for. And so we need to constantly work on keeping momentum, keeping things moving towards it. After the meeting, after the interaction, then we have to turn the potential into reality. That's when the leveraging factor. So if you look at this formula, 2/3 of what's necessary to facilitate an outcome happens outside of the meeting. That point in time where we're all together, digitally or physically, that's only 1/3 of what it takes to get something done. Now, admittedly, sometimes the bit before and after can be brief, it can be simple, but other times it can actually take more time than the time we spent in the meeting. Patrick Lencioni is an author. He's written a number of books. He's written a book called Death by Meeting. He's written a book called the Dysfunctional Description of Dysfunctional, I forget the name of it. He's really famous for it, actually. I was looking at it a moment ago, and now that slipped out of my head. Dysfunctional team. So his quote is saying the majority of meetings should be discussions that lead to decisions. Now, if that's true, then that's why we need this formula. So every time you get together with more than one person in any kind of interactive, communicative environment, we need to be thinking about what preparation do we need to be beforehand? How do we keep things moving? And what am I going to do with this afterwards? Because if we're not having a discussion to make a decision, maybe a different kind of communication medium is appropriate. Can I ask, Guy, would you put that other poll up for us?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think before we get into talk, we're going to talk about webinars in a moment. We're going to talk about the video side of it in a moment, which is where we're going to wrap up. So this is a question about, and this is your opportunity to have a bit of a think about what it is you don't like about meetings in your workplace, right? And you can tick multiples. And they tick multiples, can't they?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Which of the following are the most common meeting mistakes in your workplace?
Yeah.
All right. We've had 10 people voting.
Don't click everyone. Don't click all of them in a fit of rage.
Go for it.
Try and be selective.
Ooh, nothing meaningful happens afterwards. Really,
I need to
really common.
I needed to increase the height of my window. I couldn't see the bottom one. Oh, it's happened again. Make it bigger. There we go. Who's winning? Nothing meaningful happens afterwards. And the meeting goes off agenda. It's neck and neck there, isn't it?
Nice to hear people don't hold meetings that they shouldn't, just to boost their self-esteem and self-importance.
It's the lowest one.
Yep. Good to hear.
I mean, that's not aimed at you, by the way, for all of you. That's not like, do you do that? That's like people. You know, that people as in not you. Other people.
It's a bit hard not to tick them all. The chat's going off a bit. Alrighty. So we'll share the results now.
Share the results. Okay. Right. Let's talk through this for a moment, given what we just talked about. Point one, 26% of you said people are expected to be there but shouldn't be there, right? That's step one. That's preparation. Who do I need? Who should be there? Make that as a decision by knowing what it's all about, what information needs to be shared, and what understanding needs to be. What's the agenda? What's the point? What's the purpose? When you have that figured out and you've done that intellectual prep, you've got a better chance of knowing who shouldn't be there, and so you don't waste their time. Right? Important attendees are not prepared for their part of the meeting. Once again, letting them know, hey, Fred, Mary, want you to come to this meeting. This is why I'd like you to be there. This is the part that I'd need you to contribute. This is the part I'm hoping you can add some advice, etc. Can you have a think about that before you come along? Or bring your reports with you, or whatever the case may be. And then they've got a better chance. They might still let you down, but you've done what you can to get them on board. So that's 2 points that are before the meeting. Meeting goes off the agenda and off relevant topics. That's momentum. That's the bit in the middle of the meeting. That's the winner, 64%. That is certainly helped by having a clear agenda and a clear purpose for the meeting. All right? The point after it, the chair is not in control of the discussion. Well, if everyone is aware of the agenda and the reason for being there, and everyone is aware of their contribution and reason for being there, then there's a chance, better chance, that everyone will help each other keep things on track, because we all know what the track should be. But if we're totally dependent upon a chair to guide the conversation moment by moment, and they don't, then we get off track. So if we're the chair, we empower others to help us chair by letting them know clearly what we're meant to be doing. So that when we say, hang on, that's not on topic, let's pull it back to this other point, where got up other people say, yeah, let's get it back to this other point. That's why I'm here. Nothing meaningful happens afterwards. That's the green, right? That's the momentum. That's like, got to leverage it afterwards. So my point is that these aren't all of them, but these are some of the most common problems that we all have with meetings, and a large percentage of them get dealt with or should be dealt with either before or after, but not during the meeting. All right. Now, getting close for push for time, I'm going to go through the next couple of points because we're going to talk through a bit about videos. I'm going to close this poll, and then we'll have questions at the end, and the questions can go on for quite some time. And we can go back and cover other questions. But let's go through these points. So I'm going to talk about video. And I'm going to talk about when we're wanting to achieve results through things like this, a meeting perhaps, and meetings and webinars are slightly different. A webinar is much more of a one-to-many broadcast environment. Meetings are where everyone gets a chance to turn their camera on and participate on a more equal footing. But when it's digital, you have a lot less control over their attention and their time. And we've talked about that last week. People can get distracted. Half of you might be playing Minecraft, for all I know, right now. Right? Or Minesweeper, even better. The environment matters. We talked about this last week, okay? So half of you said that you like to see the background. There's still a background, right? Was the plant there last time? Not sure. I can't remember, but you guys will. I honestly cannot remember precisely which day that plant was put there. Was it put there since last week? You tell me, you'll have a better idea. So that's an example of how the environment is important. The setup, the positioning, right? The camera matters, right? If I was talking to my notes, and I'm going to do that now, I'm going to talk to my notes from the camera, what matters the most. So you're supposed to talk to the camera. So I'm now not talking to the camera. So ask yourself in your mind and in your heart and in your emotions, how much does this feel different? How different does it feel? And then when I go back to talking to you, that's what I've just done. No, I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to the camera. But that's what it does. When we're not there in person, we talked about the fundamental elements of body language, of the way in which our tone of voice, the cadence and rhythm of our voice carries a lot more of our meaning than we can deliver, because they're not seeing all of us. So I talked about exaggerated movements. I talked about being able to inject a certain level of energy because you've only got this much frame with which to project that energy. And it does take more energy because it doesn't give you back. So you talk about the introvert versus extrovert. So the extrovert is the person who gets a lot of energy back from the interaction with others. And when there's no one there or they're not interacting, they don't feel as energized. Whether you're inclined to introvert or extrovert, if you're giving a webinar, you're not getting a lot of energy back. I'm in an empty room. I have to manufacture in my mind the link between me and all of you. I know the link is there. I know it's real. But the primitive human element of my mind doesn't feel it. It's not instinctive. I have to create that instinct, and I have to put the energy into the discussion as if you were there. And that's why it takes a lot of energy. So when I do this for an hour and a half, I'm mentally drained afterwards because you put the energy in. But you have to do that if you want the results. If you want the connection with the people that you're speaking to, you need to put that level of energy in. If you're just a passive participant, you don't need to. But if you're a facilitator, if you're an influencer, if you're trying to get positive results, you need to make the effort. And then you have the 6-second rule. 6-second rule is one of the principles of the user experience and digital interaction that says that you really need to give people a reason to continue listening or to continue tuning in every 6 seconds. Because every 6 seconds, some part of their brain is looking to be distracted. And it is, you are. Parts of your brain is thinking about other stuff. And if I don't give you something more to tag on to, 6 seconds is roughly the period of time when your brain will start telling you about, what's for dinner, what are you going to do tomorrow, what messages have you got, etc. So some of this is covered in the pre-recorded audio, so I'm not going to go through it in a great deal of detail. The background behind you, you make it either clean or you make it symbolic. You want it to either contribute to the story, like images on a slide would, or white space, blank space, so that it doesn't detract from you. The main objective, if you can just simply avoid distractions, that's usually enough. If you can add something to the mood, even better, right? How you position. Now, I'm center frame. I'm not using the rule of thirds here. The rule of thirds is that you've got these 3 lines and I should be at an intersection. So really, if I was using the rule of thirds, I might be somewhere like this, or I might be somewhere like this. Now I'm choosing not to, and I'm doing it deliberately, particularly because of the field of view that I'm in. And so I've also turned off autofocus. So I went into the settings manually and I switched it off and I changed the focus setting so that it's focusing at this distance. So even if I'm out of the way, it still doesn't automatically focus on the back. Actually, it just did. My goodness, it's reset itself.
Who knew?
It's made a lawyer out of me. Hey, so anyway, what you should do is what I should do, which is set the autofocus. I just demonstrated it not working. Right. Still an effective demonstration. 3-point lighting. Right. These things. I'm going to show you these things. I'm going to pull this up a little bit. Yeah, right there. This thing. I know it's blinding. Right. It's an LED light. You can do different colors with it. $20. $20. If you're presenting to any kind of audience, if you're just talking to your team members, a handful of people, maybe not. But if you're talking to a larger group on a regular basis, proper lighting may be necessary. I've got 2 of them, one left, one right, and I've got a light in front of me which went off halfway through the presentation. Technical problems. I got an above light, and I use this little light behind me as a ghost light that gives you a reason to why the top of my head is shiny, because you can't see the real one. So make some effort for lighting. All right, make an effort with the camera. My point, make sure the lens is clean. Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I had one of those moments where, I'm having a cup of coffee, a little bit tickles the throat, goes the wrong way. You cough whilst drinking, coffee goes everywhere. I cleaned everything except the lens of my camera until the next time I was on camera. And then that's a bit. So make sure it's clean. Most cameras will do, but field of view matters. Audio, a decent microphone. Okay, so when I say decent microphone, you could easily spend $50 on a good mouse and keyboard. You should easily spend that much on a microphone if you're going to be doing any amount of work. Right? This sort of thing, $60. Now, you might think, what do I need that for? There's a microphone on my laptop. It's not going to give you anywhere near the same presence. Would you dress up? Would you wear nicer clothes on a day where you're going to stand in front of 50 people and give a talk? Would you do your hair differently? Would you make sure that your shoes are clean? If you're going to go to that effort, that's what the microphone is. That's its job. It's your voice, it's your tone, it's your clarity, it's your presence. So get a decent microphone. And beware of background noise. That's a pretty obvious one. We talked a bit about that last week. Know what the gain is on the microphone, right? So this is a condenser microphone. It's got a pretty broad range. I can kind of move to the side. But when I do pre-recorded audios, which some of you have listened to, I use one of these. So this is a dynamic microphone. It has a very narrow range, and it's got one of these pop filters, which is meant to block the air being when you are talking to it. I don't use a pop filter on this because I turned up the gain and I've moved it down out of the way, so it's not within range of my breath. But know the difference. Know how your microphone works. Right? That's the pop filter point. Know its capture range, so the polarization of the audio, because the audio is the message. So when you relate this back to a slide deck, right? A slide presentation, the presenter, what they say, they are the presentation. But the slide deck is just the visual aid. It's not the presentation, they are. In online delivery, your voice is the presentation. Everything else is dressing. Everything else is style, it's flair, it's impact, it's your voice that matters. If you spend time, effort, and money on nothing else, spend it on your ability to be sound, clear. As your presence, I've talked about eye contact. I've talked about body language, right? Being open. I've talked about the energy you put into your voice, how you project. And if you're not passionate about something and you're not even excited about it, at least if you can't pretend that much, at least be interested. You want the others to be interested because otherwise you're wasting their time. So you need to show a level of interest that matches what you want back from them. But ultimately, you need to still be yourself. So you still need to be the kind of person you are. You're still using your communications standards, your communications methods. You're still being yourself. But we don't overdo it because it's not a performance. It's a production, not a performance. And I want to drill down on the difference between the two. A production simply means that effort is made on some of the peripheral elements that contribute to the overall impact. Performance is where it's acting, it's pretending, it's untrue. So I said a moment ago, act interested. Well, act as interested as you should be for having spent the time to be presenting and for other people spending their time. That requires a certain amount of interest. Do that much at least. But other than that, we're not wanting to be in any way artificial. We don't perform. Now, there's a couple of points about editing. This is only if you're doing pre-recorded. Do make sure that if you're editing and cutting things, it's seamless. Making sure that if you do a dub and sync, that it lines up. Beware of adding any music to anything that you record. Any music that has same audio range that's parallel and similar to voice should be avoided. And generally, you just don't want music at the same time as voice. Beware of video intros and so on. A few seconds. If you've got an intro that's a few seconds of something minor, that's usually enough if you're going to do that. And keep special effects to a minimum. But these things are only relevant if you're doing a recording of something.
I like that. Just don't.
Just don't. Yeah. Now, look, there'll be exceptions to all these rules. There'll be counters to all of this guidance and advice. There'll be situations where it is appropriate. What I'm presenting is what most people would start with as their default position, and change it if you have a reason. Know what the reason is, but then, react to that. All right. We've got questions. I'm guessing and hoping we'll get a few more. This is a reminder of what we're going to do next week. We're going to be talking about more personal communication. So we're going to talk a bit about personal branding. We're going to talk about confrontation. We're going to talk about a few things like that are a little more personal. We're going to talk about influence. So we'll talk a bit about social media influence and how that works. So there's a few things like that we'll cover that will hopefully be helpful and useful at a more personal level for many of you. All right, there'll be a quiz and a slide deck up there a little bit later. So keep an eye out for that shortly. What questions have we got, Guy?
We got about 15 of them, and no doubt more will flood in. I just wanted to quickly touch on a couple of things from the chat as well. A lot of people were talking about video interviews at the moment because of COVID-19.
Yes.
A lot of it would just translate directly across all of that, being energetic and showing interest and passion.
Yep.
Super important. And then a lovely comment from Camille, who said that you do a really good job of maintaining energy and connection. So thank you, Camille.
Thank you. And the hard part is that it's sincere, and the reason I get to make it sincere is that I'm constantly reminding myself of the bits that I enjoy and why I enjoy it. I keep that top of mind, and it's easy to have a smile on your face when you do it. But if your mind is thinking about the bits you don't like, it's easy to lose the smile and lose the energy.
Alrighty, let's have a look at some of the most recent questions, given we just talked about them. How do you recover from making the mental effort? How do you manage or avoid wasting energy?
The energy is an investment. So the first thing is to not think of it as anything other than an investment. And if it doesn't get the results, then there could be other reasons for that. But I never think of it as anything other than I've invested in that outcome. And so the recovery process has no resentment attached to it. It doesn't have any negativity attached to it. It's just like, if I exercise, if I did some star jumps, I'm going to have to catch my breath. I don't have a resentment for that because I've invested in fitness. And so that's the mental process that I use. That means that I get to just think of the recovery as a natural part of having been through it. And during the recovery, I'm thinking, oh, that was I think about the good things. There's always negatives to think about as well, but I just want to feel good afterwards. So I think, yeah, that bit was good. That bit was good. That bit was good. That comment was nice. And before I know it, whatever recovery is over, I'm fine. Personally, that's what works for me.
Yeah, personally, I just take a little while to get to sleep after one of these if it's a fairly late one. Just wind down, read a book or whatever.
So rule of thumb, 25 to 50% is your wind down period. If you've spent a period of time, you would need to, whatever you've spent giving energy, at least 25 to 50% of that, you should have nothing really important to do straight after. Don't jump into the next. I mean, sometimes we have to, but if you can spare a bit of time to chill out, do something relaxing, do something low energy afterwards, that's the period of time that I think should be set aside afterwards.
Good to know. Brenton, Joe asks, how are you impacted by the energy created by the number of or focus of feedback questions or lack of questions?
Significantly. And it's something that I need to try to mitigate because it can affect me. Like if I'm expecting a lot more, then I might insulate myself from that by not having the chat window open or not having the Q&A window open. But because there's been plenty of interest and there's lots of things happening, or I just need to take that risk. If there's not a lot going on and that's just like when you're in front of a crowd, and when you're talking in front of a crowd and you're not getting that vibe back from them, you feel it. It's quite difficult you wonder if you're on the right track. And then you've got to make a decision, well, do I plow on with my plan or do I try and adapt? And usually plowing on with your plan is the best option, unless you've done it so many times that you really can adapt it on the fly. But it certainly psychologically, it is relevant, but it's something that, having done this often enough, I have tools and tricks within my own mind to manage its impact. So I can just push forward because I have a clear plan of what I'm going to say. And that's my saving grace. That's what I go back to. Just say the next thing I've got to say. And then something good will happen a moment later.
Yeah, perhaps like an example from me. I remember the most recent single session webinar we did, which was just sort of as we were breaking into COVID. It was sort of a mini version of this short course. We were expecting a particular crowd of sort of relatively experienced people who would be engaging a lot and we'd have more of a discussion. But it turns out that there were a lot of people that were really new to digital communication, and there were very few questions. So we just saw Brenton, adapt on the fly. He knew the underlying theory and turned it into more of a lecture. It was quite something.
Yeah, I mean, I made the assumption that people didn't have questions because they were still digesting a lot of what they just heard. So and that's the assumption I made as a presenter, and I said, well, if that's the case, then I will begin to have a bit more of a chat to recontextualize some of what we just covered, to maybe help them with their synthesis of that new information.
And that's something you'd be looking at in the preparation for a webinar or for a meeting or whatever. But the COVID time was, such a difficult time to sort of know what to do. You can get it wrong still.
Well, you have the what ifs, right? And if you do the what ifs often enough, then they become a little bit more subconscious and you can grab them. They become a toolkit that you could use at different times. But having the what if planning, what if this happens or what if this doesn't happen, is also helpful.
Sim has asked, how do you keep everyone involved in a meeting, which is probably going to be quite difficult. But what do you do when you clearly see that a couple of participants are not interested in what you are talking about, and perhaps they should be?
Okay, so that last point is the most important. Perhaps they should be. So if that's not there, then it's on you, because if you're talking about something that isn't their bit, that they're not required or expected to be interested, you could forgive them for tuning out. Let them tune out. Maybe you need to say, Fred, Mary, this bit isn't for you, but in a few minutes, we'll be talking about your stuff. So if you feel that you need to, let them tune out. Let them know. Set the expectation. I'm going to be talking to you in a few minutes' time, but right now I'm not. But if they're meant to be tuned in, then maybe they already know it. Maybe they really did read the thing that you just emailed. They don't have any questions. They've already asked their questions, and they're just there because they want to make everyone else see that they're there. But maybe they know it already. Maybe it's nothing sinister about it. Or maybe they're listening to something and it's not too complicated. Not everyone processes at the same speed. Some people really need to pay attention and focus. Other people, yeah, they get it. They're a few steps ahead and they're tuned into it very effectively. Some people not. So there isn't always a problem. There's always a reason, but that reason isn't always a problem, and it isn't always necessarily a problem to be fixed. It could be circumstantial. If it's the same people all the time, ask them, hey, I noticed you're, bit lazy-eyed last meeting. Was it okay? Was it too slow for you, or were you just distracted or something? Give them the respect of they've got a real reason and you just want to know, and let them say, yeah, I know it, I read it, or so-and-so told me already, or yeah, it's not really my area, my department, whatever the reason is, give them a chance to tell you. And then you can compartmentalize that, put that away and say, well, I'm not going to worry about that next time, because what I'm worried about is, am I being deliberately tuned out and disrespected? Or what I'm worried about is my message wrong? All right. And so if a large number of people are tuning out from my message, then maybe it's gone on too long. Maybe it's too extended. Maybe I haven't been concise, because you've got to earn their attention every 6 seconds. So in your testing, in your previous, am I doing that? Am I meeting that requirement consistently? If not, take some stuff out of it. Put it in the email that you send, and put it in the prep, put it in the follow-up. Thin it down, make it much more concise and relevant by shifting stuff before and after. That's why I send you guys an hour of pre-recorded audio. You don't want to hear me on a webinar, face talking my way through all that stuff for an hour. You can get that yourself in your own time. No, you don't. You can get that in your own time. And then afterwards, there's the webinar recording.
Yeah, you've got to make yourself vulnerable in doing that, though, don't you?
Yeah. But having said that,
asking that question.
That wasn't a very concise answer to that question, was it?
We don't come to you for concise. We come for you for in-depth.
No, good.
All right. I'll cut questions off here. We've got another 20 to go still. So that'll take us through till 9 o'clock, folks, local time. And maybe we'll have one last question on just that last group of slides and then go straight back up to the top. Kerry, Brent asks, Brenton, you mentioned your voice being so important. Some people naturally have a great voice. How do we go about improving voice? Do you have any tips?
Yes. Now, voice coaching, complicated process, lots of things to it. 2 important tips that I would give as a suggestion. Okay, 3. I'll break it down into 3 things. And you can make this a mantra. You can make this quite simple. The first is clearly enunciate every word. So don't use contractions. Don't shorten things too much. And make your lips work. Make the speech happen syllable by syllable, sound by sound. And if you make that a habit, then you will be much clearer. Your voice will be clearer. You'll be easier to understand. The second part, which is related to that, is open your mouth. When you speak, you've got to open enough to let the words out, to let the sounds out. So being able to open is part of projecting. Right? And the third thing is keep it simple. Simplify what you need to say. That means slowing it down a little bit. So if you need to focus on your speech, if you need to focus on how you say it, focus on your lips and their movement, then the easiest way to do that until it becomes habit is to just slow down a little bit. Slow it down, simplify it enough that you can focus on exactly how you are enunciating, and it'll become easier as you go. And you'll be able to do things like, when you slow it down, you get rid of the ums and ahs and the fillers, because your brain can keep up more effectively and get it to a certain pace that you're comfortable with, and then it'll just naturally and gradually increase. But voice coaching, a real thing. Lots of people do it. It's worth doing. You can do it online. There are lots of great voice coaches out there, in fact, all over the world. It can be inexpensive, and a couple of hours of coaching, and some people can significantly boost how they come across vocally.
Cool.
Recommended.
Mike V, will go back up to the top, asks, bit of an esoteric one. If I want to utilize some of Brenton's words in a paper for a current uni assignment, what would the details be for a Harvard citation? Or perhaps I might ask, is that a good idea?
So it's published, so it will qualify what we're doing, in the webinar material and the pre-recorded audio material would qualify because it has a date of publish, it has a source, it has accessibility because you can put a link in. It's not paywalled or anything because it's free course. So anyone who is reading your work can look it up. And that's what references need to be. They need to be accessible. A citation needs to be something that you can go and check. What did Brenton really say? What was the rest of what he said? So in that sense, it fits all the criteria. How would you do it? You would, well, APA, which is what a lot of them use, which is what I'm familiar with, has recently updated the way in which you cite video and recordings and audio recordings. They used to have to say, well, if it's an audio recording, you'd cite it like a book, but that's changed and improved a little bit now. There are new rules. It really depends on which rules you're using as to exactly how do you cite it, but I would be citing it as recorded audio or recorded video. And there are ways to do that depending on your system, but certainly there's no problem doing it. And the problem is if you're going to cite specifically and it's an hour-long recording, you might need to use the video hop tool and use a cue timing, like how many minutes in lieu of a page number.
Yeah, video help's really good for that, folks.
Yeah, it's a great way to pinpoint certain steps, like chapters.
Yeah. But also you can find almost always online a really thorough guide to any particular referencing system. So if someone's able to just have a quick look, if they're really familiar with it, maybe chuck it in the chat and Mike, we can have a look at it there. Eric asks, are there any role of external factors for unsuccessful collaboration in an organization? What is the role of external factors and how do you control for them?
So the simplistic, easy answer I would give you is that there are always external factors, and that part of the success of a team is always going to be how well does that team deal with the external factors. But a lot of the time, that's going to come down to identity. So it will be influenced a lot by how the team identifies themselves in relation to the external factor. So if they see that external factor as rivalry, it'll be different to if they see it as authority, or it'll be different if they see it as regulatory, or if they see it as competitive or subordinate. Where that external force comes from and how they perceive it based on how they perceive themselves. So this is one of the reasons why when you look at sport, success breeds success. A successful team in sport that gets a habit of winning and success will be able to come from behind more often than teams that aren't used to winning. And that's the psychological element of who am I and how do I see myself and how do I see us and how does us deal with that? And that's what's going to define it. So it goes back to identity. So if a team has a real struggle with an external force, it's because that external force is really troubling, undermining, damaging, or not working with the team's identity. So work on the team's identity and how they see themselves. Either say, look, you're not competitors, you're not rivals. They're not the boss of you. You're not the boss of them. Whatever it is, if there's an assumption, there's something you need to demystify, go back to that to resolve it. And that might give you some success.
Thank you. A couple of questions on hierarchy. First from Jeanette. Hierarchy is one thing, but the team can often have, for example, public service folk or contractors where the contractors have industry experience. How does the team blend in this situation?
So that I would suggest comes back to being clear as to what roles and contributions exist within the team. What's the role of that contractor? What's the role of that person? And that needs to be respected by the rest of the team and understood by that contractor to say that, okay, you're part of this team and there might be some temporary, you're not a permanent part of the team perhaps, but this is your role, this is your contribution. And you need to help the team know this person's coming in for this reason, and we need to respect that contribution. Now, sometimes there is the hardest part, because some people in the team are like, we don't need that. We don't need this. Well, then you might need to go with the consequence discussion and say, well, I know maybe we don't all feel that we need it, but other people who kind of have the power to make the decision feel that we do. And, you know, if we'd been able to influence them, we might have avoided that, but we haven't. So now we have to work with that situation and make the most of it, because otherwise, if there's negative outcomes, it might reflect on us more than it reflects on the consultant that we said wasn't necessary. And so sometimes you have to bring the stick into the equation, but fundamentally it's about making sure everyone understands what the role is, what the value is, what the contribution should be, and how they mutually respect that. And this also goes back to the contractor. They need to know this is your role, this is your contribution. Try not to step on other things outside of that. Or if you need to, want to, think you should, here's some protocols to follow to help others know that you think you should morph your contribution. It's about the mutual respect of contributions and roles.
And if you include mutual respect of contributions and you sort of try and keep it as inclusive as possible, Fabrizio asks, are we trying to flatten the structure as much as possible? And it seems to Fabrizio that there will always be some kind of hierarchy. You know, I hear the term the hierarchy of knowledge quite frequently. You know,
well, there's always going to be a hierarchy of leadership, but the difference, there's always going to be a hierarchy that's bottom up rather than top down. So I used the word hierarchy before in the context of top down structure, but even if you never have that and you have a flat structure, you still have a bottom up hierarchy, and that's followership. So even when you don't have bosses and designated leaders, you have people who will follow this person more than they'll follow that person. And that will create a hierarchy, because certain people will get more buy-in, certain people will have more influence. And that's the facilitator empowerment discussion that we had before. That's because a person is deemed to be worthy of following. I'm going to give them influence over what I do next because I trust their judgment, and I trust I have buy-in to their vision and the way they envisage things. Now, in a team environment, you want that. You want that sort of thing, but you want it in a positive, healthy way. What you don't want is different people of that nature competing with each other, in which case you might need to deal with that because we talked about team psychology. It's the contrast between willingness to support the team and everything the team does and team success versus I don't want to be personally threatened and at risk for that. So when the teamwork is suffering, it's because people are worried about their personal situation. They're worrying about self-interest, and naturally so. So that's an approach that I would suggest that might help. Yes, there's always going to be a hierarchy, but you want it to be a natural follower-based where it's willful buy-in, not enforced top-down, you'll do this no matter what. So I agree that with Fabrizio, there's definitely, but that's a healthy hierarchy. And I wouldn't call it a hierarchy. I would still call it a structure, but it's a structure where leaders delegate their power. Leaders are the ones that say, well, you follow me, so now I'm going to empower you and help you make your decision. And that's kind of how leadership works to some extent. So leaders don't guard their power and authority as much. And so it's much healthier.
Cool. It's something I've been thinking about all week. Is you know, it's what you do with it, right? Like, you know, you can have a really healthy team, but it depends what the objectives of the team are. And a really simplistic question is, can this course be used for evil? Can you professionally communicate terrible things and influence people unduly?
So I've talked neutrally about the objectives a number of times, and I've said, you know, the objectives matter in all forms. Even from week one, we talked about communications got an objective. And yeah, you can have objectives that are one-sided. You can have objectives that are zero-sided, where they're just totally harmful. And the only counter I would say is that when you have enough of the factors at play with real communications and the tests that go on in communications as recipients, that when recipients know the standards that they should be working to, then they're better able to test the intentions of those who would use communications for nefarious purposes. It's not a cure, but what it does is it steps it a little bit above the ignorance that deception relies upon. Deception undoubtedly relies upon ignorance. It also relies upon trust, but then good teamwork and collaboration relies upon trust. And that trust can be easily broken, but it can also be leveraged for personal gain. The idea is that it should not be leveraged for personal gain for very long because of the governance elements that we talked about before. There's always going to be a team dynamic which has a higher principle above all of it. And that's where the professional goals, the strategy, the company, the organization sits above that. And there needs to be some degree of downward investigation, which is governance oriented, that says, is things working the way we expect, the way they should? Are we seeing any problems that need to be intercepted? Is there any interventions required? And that's something that needs to happen, because in a good team, you might get a good team that put up with a bad apple, because them getting the job done, putting up with a bad apple is the most effective way for them to do that. But that bad apple might still be holding back the team from what they could be doing. You still need to have some mechanism from some representative of the very highest ideal that says, what can we fix here that you guys struggle to fix by yourselves? So not saying that you don't need that. It can still be required, or you can still get very toxic situations that need a much more direct approach to solve them, or at least solve them quickly.
Thank you. Roger asks, is there collaboration when the team is still in a forming stage, or is this still in the cooperation? Is collaboration only achieved in performing teams?
So it depends how much opportunity they have over deciding their roles and their contributions, etc. And in the best teams, there usually is discussions and decisions made to get people to buy in. This is where you get people to help define their own role and function, and there's a bit of give and take and all of that. When you have that, then yes, you have collaboration at the forming stage. And when you can do that with sufficiently mature and responsible individuals that perhaps are used to this or good at this, that can be some of the most empowering pieces of it, because that's where people get to be or find the best kind of role that's going to give them the best opportunity to shine. And then you synergize all that and wonderful things happen. So you might not, if no one knows each other and everyone's very defensive and awkward and has come from a different situation or bad politics, then you may have less of that. So there's no simple answer, right or wrong. You want to have it and you want to leverage it when it works, but you might need to supplement it when it doesn't.
Alrighty. Bernard asks, how can one deal with a situation when there's an older person as a subordinate in age? Or what age, how do you correct for age?
You need more one-to-one interaction. So the simplest solution I would suggest is the person who's older is going to have different things to offer than someone else. Now, yes, there are exceptions. There are people who manage to get through life without having accumulated a great deal of wisdom. But if we assume that there's a correlation between the journey and having accumulated wisdom, then a lot of what older subordinates want is to just get that bit of recognition for what they do have, and a more one-to-one interaction to help you as a leader, as a facilitator, understand what's important to them, understand what's special to them, because they might come from a different culture. Their journey of cultural evolution has been a lot longer, perhaps, than others. And so they might have a more complicated evolutionary process, and some things are not as quick and easy and comfortable for them to adapt to. And so if we want their expertise, their influence, their experience, we want all the good things, then we might need to reciprocate with, yeah, I understand that this process isn't comfortable for you. How can I make that easier? Now, there's always going to be a limit to the amount of investment anyone can make in dealing with the uniqueness of any particular team member, whatever the reason might be. But if you lump them together and say, people that are much older than me but are subordinates, that's where I'd start. More direct communications to understand what's important to them and help them understand that that's an important thing to you, find a common ground. You might need to get them to say, well, can you help me with this? Can you help me solve that? Get their input and value what they can bring, and you will have them value you more intrinsically.
Hope that helps. Zara asks, how can we solve gender bias in a teamwork as a team leader? Should it be considered in structure or as an issue we should consider in our policy itself?
That's a much more complicated one, because that is going to be significantly more impacted by culture at a geographical level, at a demographic level. You're going to find people of a different age group are going to have a different cultural bias towards gender discrimination. There are going to be people in different age groups that are more tolerant of it and people that are less tolerant, and there's going to be trends. Where they come from in the world, or where they live, or where they grew up is going to have an impact on that. How they see themselves, whether they see themselves as part of any other form of minority who has suffered from other forms of discrimination, it's all going to have an impact. So there's no good answer to this, because you're going to have some people, you say, well, we need an artificial structure here for gender bias. Now, if you look at what goes on with gender bias, it's absolutely real. There's no myth about it. There is very definitely a phenomenon that we as a species need to deal with. And I'd say we as a species and we as a society, because these problems have been with us for thousands of years. And thousands of years ago, when things were not, when equity and being equivalent was not as easy, things were very different. We carried a lot of that with us into a time and place where it's just not needed anymore and it's not appropriate. But artificially changing that is often necessary, not so much to say, okay, we're going to structurally change this. A lot of the time what we're trying to do is what I talked about before. We're trying to use policy to incrementally alter the culture and the habits. So we're trying to incrementally alter the attitudes that people have that say, well, if people have a subconscious bias or even a conscious one, we want to chip away at that. Now, at times when it's blatant and obvious, we need a rule that just locks down and removes it, because it's damaging, it's toxic, it's poison, it's a real problem. But if it's more subtle, we need to work at it on an ongoing basis. You can't just say, well, here's a rule, now we're all okay. We're not going to be okay. It's something that's going to have to happen over generations, and it's going to have to keep happening. But the reason it will improve over time, and the reason why it's improved recently, is a combination of lots of discussion about what it really means and what it really does, lots of conversation about how unnecessary the gender discrimination is, and how we can put sometimes rules against it, but at the same time, chip away little bits and pieces. So the most fundamental, and to answer that question in the final point, the most significant place in our entire society where gender discrimination needs to be worked upon is in parenting. How we raise our kids is what's going to make our species move out of this phase. And it's not going to be changed dramatically by what we do in the workplace. We're just dealing with the symptoms there. It needs to happen in the way parents raise their children. And that's why you have the demographic issue I said, where young people have a different view today than people of a much older demographic, because the impact of parenting is trickling down and it will continue to do so. So reason to hope, but yeah, you need a bit of both, and there's no easy answer to it.
Thank you. A few questions about meetings. Do action points in meeting minutes enhance the leverage level?
Yes, if they're complete. So an action point needs a detailed action. It needs a time frame. It needs enough of a test to be measurable, and it needs a name attached to it. So you've got to have an accountability, and you need a follow-up action. So you don't just need a deadline. You need and what happens after the deadline? What's the next step? So it's not just, well, Fred's going to do this by Monday. Well, what if he doesn't? Well, I don't know, right? So action items, whoever is taking responsibility to it, they need to commit to all of those things in the meeting as the action item is recorded. And if they haven't agreed to all of that yet, you're not done. So an action item is like, Fred, you're going to have that by what is it you're going to have by Monday? This, and this. Okay, great. And by what time Monday? 5 p.m. Okay, right. So what if you don't? Well, and this is where someone else, Mary, says, well, if he doesn't, this is how it's going to impact me. This is the consequences of that action item failing by that deadline. So then what's the second action follow-up for Fred? Well, I'm going to be knocking on Fred's door. Okay. So then you have enough of a detail around an action item that it'll do its job. Until then, it's just a wing and a prayer.
Wow. I'm in trouble. I'm in trouble. In digital meetings, what's too big for a video meeting? The number of participants?
Well, we've had hundreds. If you took a meeting, okay, meeting, not webinar.
Yeah.
How many can you fit on the screen? No, it's a lot about how many people are likely to participate. How many people are likely to have something to say? And is everyone going to take turns? Like, the round robin reporting thing, that doesn't need to be a meeting. That can be something that can be done separately. I've spoken to organizations. I helped one organization recently shift their round robin. That is like 12 to 14 people that would get together in a Zoom call and have their chat. So I said, well, look, why don't you have that 10 minutes where everyone does a video recording and records the 10 minutes of what they would have said. And then you put that on an intranet and everyone can just look at, I want to see what this person said, but the rest of them, I don't. But if you try and do it in structure and say, well, you only need to turn up for these little bits of the meeting, well, that's not going to work. They're not going to turn up for the rest of it. Or they're not going to just log in precisely on cue. Not going to happen. So it's about what really belongs in that meeting. You can have as many people as you like. If it's a one-to-many broadcast, then you've got to keep it locked down to this is its purpose and this is why I'm broadcasting it. But if it's a broadcast, could it just be a recording that you've sent out? Hey, I'm going to send you, follow the link, watch this, it's 10 minutes, then we'll have a meeting afterwards. And the meeting afterwards will be 10 minutes. So that way people can look at the first part of their 10 minutes at another time. It gives you that flexibility. I'm just throwing ideas out there. There is no limit. It really comes down to what's the purpose and what's the most efficient way and how you're going to keep them interested every 6 seconds. If you come back to trying to solve that problem, then a whole bunch of things go out the window.
Okay, 2 questions left, everyone. Anne asks, how about virtual boards? I don't know what virtual boards are, Brenton.
So is Anne talking about virtual whiteboards? I don't know.
Yeah, like we can use here. We use them in Zoom sometimes. And if
so that's okay. So yes, okay, that is what talk about. So let me answer from 2 points of view. Firstly, it's a personal skill set thing. I love using a whiteboard in person. I think much better on a whiteboard if I'm having a brainstorming and stuff. I'm all over it. Digitally, I haven't mastered that yet. I mean, yes, I know how to do it, but I haven't included that into my flow. So it's a bit forced for me to do that. But it's something that people get familiar with, get comfortable with. Yes, it can be a great tool, but it's a tool. So you've got to think of, why do you use it? Now, in a real environment, I used it because if I'm doing something among a group of people, it helps me think. If I'm leading and facilitating a workshop or something. But if that's what it does for you, then, and that's how you use it, that's great, but make sure that that's meaningful for what the participants are doing. If it's something that everyone can participate in, it can get a little bit crazy because you don't have the real world thing where you've got to get up and grab the pen and stand up there, etc. Anyone can just doodle at any time. You've got to have a bit more discipline about it. So you have to set some expectations and some structure. So it really comes back to what purpose does it fulfill? And if it fulfills a purpose in your interactions, I think it's a great tool. It can be very effective. It can be useful. But I don't see it getting used very often because I believe that the circumstances and where it's used might be more limited. And the simplest thing to do is ask for feedback. If you've been using it for a while, or you want to use it, or you want to try it, use it, try it, or ask people. Ask some of your attendees and say, how's that working for you? Do you like how that works? And they'll tell you, and go by what they say. So they're the ones that you need to prove that the tool is working. They're the ones you should be listening to their feedback.
Yeah, and just one thing I'd add is it sort of depends on your gear as well. Just like a mic and you know, your headset and your lighting, it's a whiteboard is far more clunky on a mouse than it would be on one of those sort of pen screen things where you can transfer it directly across. It depends how accurate you need to be. Depends on all sorts of things.
If you've got a touchscreen laptop with a pen, go nuts, right? It's really, that's easy to do, right? I agree with you. So then it's still comes back to suitability of the tool, and not only the tool, but its execution.
And final question, designed as if it was designed for me. Thank you, Ashley. How to be a neutral facilitator? Something I struggle with. If you also have a contribution role and maybe a strong view.
Wow, that's a good one.
And do you even need to?
So I don't want to cheat and give an easy answer, because the easy answer would be, well, you know, can you really be both? Can you divest yourself from your point of view? And I think usually the answer is no. And usually the answer is, well, we shouldn't. And this is where the empowerment of a facilitator really plays a part. So if you can get empowerment because people buy into your facilitation style, where you can be and proven to be fair and even with hearing everyone else's point of view, with getting arguments, with having challenges to your view when you have a strong view, if you can show that even-handed facilitation, then people will be much more accepting of you saying, well, I have a really strong view, but I want to hear your really strong view too. A lot of that is sequencing. If you go in and say, right, I'm facilitating that, and here's what I think first, then people will react to that as if you're grandstanding and you're using it as a podium and a soapbox, and then they'll be in fight back mode. So if you seize the initiative, then they will be on the defensive, they'll be on the counterattack mindset. But if you start in saying, I've got a particularly strong view on this, but I want others to have a chance to talk first, you're deferring, you're taking a step back, you're giving respect. Suddenly they're nowhere near as defensive, they're nowhere near as protective of their point of view. You're saying, well, you have first go at this. And then you will come in later with your point of view that looks a lot more even and a lot more balanced. That's the only trick that I can think of that will help you, is bring your strong view later when everyone else has had their chance, because then they'll have their say in a much more relaxed position and won't be as forceful about it. Won't need to be. They're not reacting to you then.
Thank you. All righty. Well, that was a good one. Sorry for keeping it late again, but actually, no, I'm not very sorry. It's a nice free course, and I hope you enjoy all of the nice free content.
A lot of great questions.
Yeah, no, really great this week. Looking forward to this Perdoco scenario next week, Brenton. It's going to be good fun. Interested to see if anyone's has taken part in the last short course we used it in, and see how things have changed. Not much left to do, but to thank Hannah, as always, for hanging around.
Thank you, Hannah.
And thank everyone for the questions and their involvement and the continued interest in the short course. They really make it so worthwhile. And of course, thank you, Brenton, who I'll leave to sign off.
And we have one more week to go where we will cover a few more things and wrap things up. Until then, that's all from us for now. Thank you and good night.